Hello. Welcome back to another installment of the Hen House at Home. I am Monica Fernandez, and I thank you so much for joining us to celebrate our fall 2021 authors and their incredible books. Before we begin, we wanted to acknowledge that the land that I am broadcasting from is the occupied and seized territory of the Gabrielino, Tongva, and Kizh people. Tonight's event features some incredible short story collections, so we wanted to highlight a collection of stories by an Indigenous author as well. In Living on the Borderlines by Melissa McCall, intergenerational memory and trauma slip into everyday life. A teenager struggles to understand her grandmother's silences. A man contemplates what it means to preserve tradition in the wake of the disappearing Indian myth. And an older woman challenges her town's prejudice while uniting in an unlikely family. With these stories, debut writer Melissa McCall weaves together an understated and contemplative collection exploring what it means to be Indigenous. From our friends at Feminist Press, pick up a copy of Living on the Borderlines from bookshop.org today. I am dropping the link right now. So I personally love reading short story collections, and I'm such a fan and a writer of short fiction myself. So I'm so excited for this particular event featuring longtime Red Hen author Jim Peterson, whose recent collection, The Sadness of Whirlwinds, comes out November 2. And Beth Gilstrap, author of the Red Hen Press Women's Prose Award-winning Deadheading and Other Stories, just out this week. I will bring them on screen right now to join me. Hi. Hey. I am doubly excited tonight because we have a guest moderator. It is our absolute pleasure to welcome Fred Arroyo to the Hen House at Home Reading and Conversation series. Fred is the author of Sown in Earth, Essays of Memory and Belonging from the University of Arizona Press, the collection Western Avenue and Other Fictions, and the novel The Region of Lost Names. Fred's writing is also included in the Library of Congress series Spotlight on U.S. Hispanic Writers. It's a huge honor to welcome him here tonight. Hello, Fred.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. All right, we'll start the evening off with some readings by Jim and Beth, so you can all enjoy their incredible prose, and then Fred will guide the conversation to follow. I'll leave you all to it, but I'll be back at the end of the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica.
So should I start? Should I go ahead and start?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Beth, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you, Monica, for the lovely introduction and for putting this together. It is a dream come true to be a part of Red Hen Press with my second story collection. And winning the prize is more than I could have imagined. And it's just been such a wonderful process putting my book into the world with these lovely humans. And thank you, Jim, for sharing the space with me and Fred for moderating. So I'm going to read two of the shortest stories in my collection. I write both traditional length and flash. So these two will clock in at about 5 or 6 minutes. They're really short. And the first one is a prime example of how nature impacts my writing. And it originally appeared in Longleaf and was reprinted in Best Microfictions. It's called Bone Words. The grass marks on his cheek when he rolled over kept me from waking him. A clump of clippings at his zygomatic bone, God knows what burrowing near his neck, near the occipital bone, along the base of his skull, where I'd held him. Soft spots no one thinks on. I like paying attention to places on a body most people take for granted. A smear of my lipstick, color medieval, true to its claim, everlasting on his Adam's apple. That sweet hunk of thyroid cartilage named for sin. His eyes, hair falling across them, still closed, still twitching like the horned beetle I'd picked off the dead pine next to our tent. I'd read in biology how when you see them, rarely any time but dusk, they're only ever searching for their lovers or fighting. Other males, only males, of course, always fighting. For decaying fruit or sap, favored mating grounds close to rotten wood. The sleeping boy is too sweet for fighting. He writes songs about my hair. The sleeping boy's brother will find out about us, alone in the old growth, our chapped skin, our damaged tint, and helplessly hope our similar smells are his imagination gone dark. I found no female, but the beetle's hiss and mandible impressed me, a dribble of my own saliva hanging as I petted his head, fighting the urge to tie a string around his dorsal plate and wear him as an amulet. Later, I will want to tell the sleeping boy's brother how lizards and snakes and beetles of the family Lucanidae have vast variations in size between juvenility and adulthood, how their bodies are bound to environment with only a smidge of genetic influence. But all I can explain before he slams the door is how females have smaller, more powerful jaws. When I drive away, I will say mandible out loud to an empty car and roll all the windows down, praying for rain, praying for wings, praying for horns of my own. And that's the end of the first story. And the second one is called Wet Magic, and it appears nowhere except in this book. And I think there is so much of me growing up with a single mom, and also with a lot of help from my maternal grandparents who grew up and came of age in the Depression. You can see that throughout the book. And I think this tiny little story is a microcosm of a lot of those things and a nod to my grandparents who are no longer with me. They sacrificed a lot for us as a family, and I never forget that. And, you know, my grandfather couldn't read, and my mom was a first-generation college student, and I fall somewhere in between those things, you know, and I never forget it. What magic? We don't live in the neighborhood anymore, not where foundations are cracked and the sides of the buildings we called home have already begun their inevitable descent, where we made games out of which marble, spyglass red or blue, would slide into the left corner of the living room. Greg even drew a basketball net, but he couldn't capture the third dimension yet, so it looked like a spider web. We don't live where the bugs come in no matter how much poison mom put out or how much she scoured the place with bleach, not where cupboards house baggies of flour, of sugar, of coffee, and cornmeal zipped up where ants and cockroaches can't get to them. I never told her how I'd pull a stool over to the counter and taste all the spices, how I chewed cloves until the tender parts of my mouth burned and went numb, how the white pepper made me sneeze, how a bug I couldn't name had crawled into the dehydrated onion. Mom must have found it because the next time I was up there, sticking my fingers in Crisco and wondering how she did what magic she did to dumplings and chicken. The onion was gone and everything else was in bags. But no. We don't make a special trip to the discount bread store where we buy 6 or 8 loaves at a time and keep them in the big freezer in the den. We don't cut people's hair in the kitchen anymore. We don't stink up the house with chemicals to make all us bone-tired women look less so. We don't have people banging on the screen door, asking for work, asking for money for a ride, saying, honey, baby, please, bless you, child, and stealing our lawnmower once it gets dark because the streetlights haven't blinked on in years. We don't have men standing on porches midwinter in their boxers, smoking and sipping from a brown bag, talking about Texas Hold'em and asking us, do we know if our mamas have any cards and pennies because they could show us how to make a living? But no. We don't plant vegetable gardens because we need the food. We don't boil cabbage and pressure cook greens, turning the whole house rank. We don't pick chickens clean or fry livers, patch the backsides and knees of our jeans, brush our teeth with baking soda, or ever hang our wet clothes on the line. And we no longer wait up for mama to get home from overtime or stay alone behind locked doors, hiding in the back of the closet, behind coats that smell like stale cigarettes and old fun, our hearts palpitating, sick with solitude come too soon. And I will stop there and turn it over.
Thank you, Beth. Those are great. And Beth, just more broadly, I think your book is fantastic. It's a really fine book. I'm going to read one short story, and this was a originally published in a very good new online journal called the Good Life Review. So go online. You can find it very easy and check it out. Those people over there are doing a great job with that new journal. Yeah, I guess that's all I need to tell you right now. It's called Go Get the Gun. Have to have these. Go get the gun. Go get the gun, Angie said. I put the book down that I was reading. What? The gun. Go get it. Hurry. I looked around the living room. Everything was quiet. I looked at my wife sitting in her favorite recliner with her favorite lamp bestowing light to the pages of a book by her favorite author. She was looking at me with big eyes over the top of the book. Well, she said, what are you waiting for? But I don't hear anything. Are you going to let the fact that you're stone cold deaf keep you from protecting me? She said. I am not deaf, Angie. I'm hearing you just fine, for example. Well, something must be wrong with you, she said. I'm not going to grab the gun every time you imagine a bad guy's trying to break in. I'm not imagining. I heard something. It's those books you read, I said, with all those deranged killers. That stuff gets into your head, Angie, and makes you paranoid. She just glared at me. After a moment or two, she lifted her book again. At last, peace was restored. Sometimes I just had to reason with Angie. After 30 years of marriage, I had learned that reason usually won the day. I looked out the window just beyond where Angie was sitting. It was pitch black out there. I could hear the wind blowing in the nearby trees. That must have been what Angie heard. That must also explain why the streetlights were out, though I admit that absence of light was a bit strange. I sighed and went back to reading my own book. I was getting into a good part when Angie said, I want a divorce. I looked at her and she was glaring at me again. This time her eyes were narrow and hard. Angie, I said, we've been together for 30 years. You do not want a divorce. Yes, I do, she said. You don't take care of me anymore. You don't believe anything I say. You always have to be right. You don't even protect me anymore. A rapist could come through that door and you would just let him have me. That's a terrible thing to say, I said, and you know it isn't true. I would gladly die for you if that's what's called for. Prove it, she said. What? You want me to die? No, I want you to go get the damn gun and make sure no one is trying to break in. I'm really frightened, can't you tell? I took off my reading glasses and put on my far-sighted glasses. She came into better focus. Yes, I could now see that she was trembling. Her eyes were glassy with fear. But Angie, I said, it's dangerous to run around with a loaded gun unless you really need it, I said. If you don't get the gun, then I want that divorce. I'm tired of being so scared all the time. When are you afraid? I asked. All the time, she shouted. I tell you, and you ignore me. I'm tired of it. I can't believe you would leave me because I don't carry a gun around all the time. There are other reasons, she said. Do you want me to list them for you? I thought about that. My balding head, my thickening middle, my 2 glasses of whiskey every night, my cousin James, who was always stopping by and staying for a week. Then I thought about Angie's blueberry pie, her beef stew, the long walks we took together, her warm body in bed, her IRA that had grown substantially over the years. I decided to get up and find the gun. Just then, I heard a crashing sound. Angie screamed but remained in her chair, holding her book against her chest as if it would protect her. I proceeded back to the bedroom where I had hidden the gun and a box of bullets buried under some of my shirts in a drawer. Angie had followed me so closely I thought we had become one 4-legged creature. I could feel her breath on my neck, her voice in my ear. I carefully loaded the 38s in the chambers of the revolver and snapped it shut. Shaking, Angie gripped my arm like she might try to rip it off. As one, we slowly trundled up the hallway. We checked and secured the front door, the back door, and the side door. There was one more door in the basement. We heard another crash, and it was definitely coming from down there. We slowly made our four-legged way down the stairs. I flipped the light switch, but the basement light had apparently burned out. Angie pulled out her cell phone and turned on its light. Everything appeared in order. The pool table, the futon, the table and chairs. We made our way over to the door that opened onto a patio. Angie pressed her phone to a window pane in the door, and outside we saw something on the patio, thrashing. I stared and stared, trying to bring it into focus, and then I saw it. A badly wounded deer trying to stand up in a slippery pool of its own blood. It had been trying to get into our house, but why? I turned the lock and opened the door. "Be careful," Angie said in my ear. I carefully pushed open the screen door. Angie remembered the patio light, switched it on, and light flooded the scene. It was a doe, and her eyes were big, black circles. She thrashed, but she couldn't get up. One of her front legs was twisted and obviously broken. She was bleeding from a hole in her shoulder. The anguished guttural of fear broke from her throat. I didn't hesitate. I walked up close to her, raised my gun, and shot her once in the head. The blast carried its message across the neighborhood. She dropped to the patio bricks, spasmed a time or two, and died. A thin trail of white smoke flowed out of her body and drifted into the trees. I had been present at other deaths, but I'd never seen anything like that before. Somewhere in the nearby woods, a hunter was probably looking for her. The wind was worse than I'd realized, throwing the heads of trees around like crazed toys. "I'm so glad you had the gun," Angie said behind me. She was suffering terribly. I turned to her. She was crying. "I don't want to divorce you," she said. I didn't want to divorce her either and said so. I realized I was crying too, trembling with a fear I couldn't name. We held on to each other for a while. Then we went back inside, leaving the deer in darkness. I unloaded the gun and left it on the table. It could take care of itself for the rest of the night. Angie and I took care of each other. That's it.
Thank you both. Those were beautiful, fantastic readings. So as you know, we got Beth Gilstrap with Deadheading and Jim Peterson with The Sadness of Whirlwinds. They're different books, both in form and shape, but there's actually a lot of overlap, and your readings kind of help to affirm that. There's just a lot of really great lyricism and detail, and I'm really enamored with that principle that you got to have both gravity and lightness to your work, and you both have that. Those were two of my favorite stories, What Magic and Go Get the Gun. They just they speak to me. I remember them well. I love how Beth uses that don't. And then your story, that comedy of his balding head, and he remembers all those details, but then it goes to the shooting of that doe. Really powerful stuff. So you both had a chance to choose something you wanted to read to share with people tonight. Future readers, everyone should go out and get both of these fantastic books. Why did you choose the stories that you chose to share tonight? How do they provide a glimpse into the whole collection, or how do they help your readers imagine what they'll encounter in the book, do you think?
Beth, you want to start? Yeah.
Sure. For Bone Words, I think that shows some of the younger characters' mindset. And I believe that there is a theme of toxic masculinity running through it, and women making poor choices a lot of women making poor choices. And I believe that one is enough of a glimpse into that without getting too dark too quickly, as some of the others do. And also because I am so inspired by nature, I love that this story, Bone Words, started from an actual encounter with a horned beetle. I found it and I was just amazed, because this is not something you see very often. In North Carolina, where I was living at the time, it's the only time I've ever seen one. And that sucker was like that big. It was really impressive. So then I started doing like all this research on it. And it just, with flash fiction, a lot of times I will have an inciting image, much like a poet. And then I just follow that image and see where it goes. So that's why I chose Bone Words. And What Magic is carries a lot of the themes that are throughout the book, with single motherhood, with poverty, and basically just trying to get by and finding joy in the small things when there is so much trauma. And there's a lot of trauma in the book, but I do think that all of my characters are trying to see the light, like you said about the balance between light and dark. No, none of them have given up yet. And I love that What Magic is kind of speaking back to the past and the narrative distance there. You can read into the subtext with, flash fiction has to be so compressed, but there has to be, the idea of something much larger. And I believe that that's present in that story, and that those themes carry throughout the book. Jim?
Oh, thank you. Beth, one of the things I really am impressed with in your stories is that some of these stories are quite short, and yet there's a lot of really vivid detail. Nevertheless, I don't know how you quite do that. Also, in some of these really short stories, you manage to get in backstory in interesting ways that just enriches the whole experience of reading the story. With Go Get the Gun, I'm primarily known as a poet. I've published a lot of poetry and collections of poetry, but I did publish a novel back in 2005, and also from Red Hen. Thank you, Red Hen. But way back when, I started writing stories and just struggled with it. I think a good short story is very difficult to write, I think. Poetry, somehow I got into poetry, and I'm a storyteller in my poems too. And I kind of left the serious writing of fiction. Every once in a while I'd go dip in. But a couple of years ago, I want to say maybe 3 years ago, I was looking for somewhat new way of getting into writing fiction, and oddly, what got me in was the poet James Tate and his late poems, the poems of his late books, and so this story. Let me see if I can find it again. Let's see. I believe it's. What I saw Tate doing, what I believed he was doing, was he was writing a first line, and then he was letting that first line take him wherever. Then he wrote a second line that followed the first line, and then he was writing a third line that followed the second line, and he just trusted it, and he just went. And those poems / stories, to me, they're narratives, they're stories. They are very. They can be very surreal, whimsical, magical. Anything can happen in those stories. And I was so this is how this story was written. I wrote down, "Go get the gun," Angie said. I had no idea what the story was about. No idea what the story was going to be about. And I just trusted it. And things just kept coming until it happened.
I love that. You heard the voice first and you followed it. I love that.
Yeah. So that's the way a bunch of the stories in this book were written. Not all of them, but a bunch of them. And I had this great lucky thing happen too. A a former student of mine who is a really good friend of mine, Nicole Cloutier. She came down and stayed with me for 6 weeks, and we wrote for 3 or 4 hours every single day for 6 weeks. And I just wrote a bunch of stuff using this method. So that's how this story and a fair number of the other, especially the shorter stories in the collection, were written. But even some of the longer ones started out that way. So it's a mysterious process to me. I love it. And also one other thing, maybe we'll get to more of this later, but I think of myself as a magical realist. And most of the time, not all of my stories are that way, but probably 75% of them have some sort of magical, something magical happens in the story, something that creates an alternate feeling about reality. So this may be one of the more naturalistic stories that I've written. There's nothing in this story that couldn't happen. In fact, happened, so anyway, that's just some background.
Good. Excellent to hear you both, because I think that what you both suggest is important for someone to discover in your books. And for Beth's collection, it is finding joy in the small things. And that's the small, short flash fictions. But even in the longer stories, it's just the smaller things that the characters encounter that change the heavy trauma and weight of work and economy in the past that's on them. And your stories are surreal and whimsical and magical, Jim, but it is that thing that you're discovering it. And when a reader reads your stories, they discover the story at the same level. So that's great. And you both kind of already said, and it's obvious in the collection, that they're stories with plenty of narrative drive and conflict and character, but they're both written from the heart and the eyes of a poet. So I was really interested in the single, that Carver title, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. I get so tired of those collections that have these huge long titles like that, What I Used to Be Back Then, or whatever, those long ones like that. But in Beth's collection, we have deadheading, as in removing the dead flowers off a plant, so new flowers are encouraged to grow. And in Jim's collection, we have whirlwind, as in a column or vortex of air created from turbulence or instability. And those are really important because they're such wonderful metaphors for reading both books. Why are those two words important to both of you? Your type, whirlwind and deadheading. Why are they important as images and metaphors for your book?
For deadheading, it is absolutely and 100% about my gardener's heart. I have been gardening since I was tiny and followed my grandparents out into their yard. They were what I call urban gardeners. They weren't, it's not like they had a whole lot of land, but my grandparents made use of every single inch of it. Even transforming a really old willow oak stump into a garden bed is on the front side of the house as well. And, it sounds made up at this day and age, but I was on the front porch snapping beans and shucking corn with my grandparents and listening to that entire generation tell stories, and while they're smoking their cigarettes and just talking so much trash. And I paid attention. But deadheading to me, when I was in a shack in the woods at Sundress Academy for the Arts outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, when I finished the first draft of the collection, I went there for that purpose. And I feel like that seeped into that last story and the title story so much. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking through all of these stories and the trauma that goes through, and how something can appear so damaged that, it's going to die, or, you're not going to get any beauty out of it again, but that it can come back. it can come back from that. And with careful attention and care, you can get rid of the old growth, the damage, and it can still thrive. So even though all of these characters are in the face of hardship of many different kinds, it's not hopeless. And it was really, really important to me at that time to look for that light as I was caring for my mother-in-law. She was terminally ill. She's since passed on. It's been a couple years, but it was 31 months of that. And I wrote most of the book in that time period. So it was my life raft, it really was. The book was, the stories were, the characters, nature, all of those things. And I feel like just the simple deadheading title really encapsulated all of that. And though the last story does have some pretty intense violence, I believe it ends on a hopeful note. And I wanted that to come across.
Because Layla's helping the young girl to try to leave that trauma behind, her mother abusing her and the death that she saw of her sister. Very powerful story.
Thank you.
And it's, at the end, it just, wow. Everything kind of comes. And for you, Jim, Whirlwind, why that metaphor image? How did that help you with your collection?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I grew up shucking corn and snapping beans on the porch too. Beth and I are both from the South, and if you grow up kind of in a little town in the South, that's just the kind of stuff you do,
Here's a bucket.
Yeah.
I just left a reading where a student was reading about shucking the corn and silking it, and it had a bunch of buckets in it.
Yeah. Whirlwinds. Okay, so that snuck up on me in a way, because I wrote a story that's called Mr. Fabulous, which is actually only one section of the three but that was the first thing I wrote. And when I wrote it, I thought it was the whole story. And maybe it is, I don't know. But these other things kept coming, and that's what happened. So there are two other sections. But that story was written with the first line, and it was written the same way. It just unfolded. And I was going, wow, whirlwinds, who knew? I mean, it was like, and then I realized that whirlwinds is a metaphor for me. I almost hate to go into this, but I'm going to do it. There is, I'm a spiritual seeker. I have been all my life. And I've studied just about every religion and spiritual path you can think of to one degree or another. For me, there are certain principles that have come down to me, and now I can't help sneaking them into my book. I can't help it. It just comes in. So I realized that a whirlwind is a totally selfless creature, because it has no brain, it has no heart. And if I can imagine it as a living being, then it can, in some ways, it can embody some of these principles that I have learned about and that are important to me. And yet it ended up being not a totally positive thing for the whirlwinds in that story. It was kind of an interest. I didn't want to just present that as the way anybody should think about being, but my character was enamored with that, my main character. So I found that the whirlwinds actually show up in little ways throughout the whole book. They appear. One guy's hair stands up in a whirlwind and things of that sort. They're around. And I just feel that they're such mysterious beings. I'm going to call them beings, mysterious beings. And they can hold, because they are empty, they can hold so much metaphorical content. I don't know if that makes sense or not. But I think that's why it ended up being an important thing for me. And then I stumbled on the sadness of whirlwinds, just the title. That may be, I love the title myself. And stumbling upon that title, it just felt like, wow, it's touching something that I can't really articulate.
Yes.
And And that's what I want to do with my fiction, is try to get to the edge of something. You know, that question of what is reality? What is the nature of reality? What is really real? What's going on in this world, you know? So whirlwinds just operate that way for me. I hope that's a reasonable answer to that.
Absolutely. Go
You know,
ahead,
Jim,
Beth.
when I was reading that story, I was thinking, wow, he's articulating something here about whirlwinds that I feel that I've never been able to express. So it's really cool to hear you describe it that way.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Because I experienced it the way you hoped.
Oh,
And
good.
you never know if readers are going to, but I did. So that's really cool.
Good. Good.
Yeah, we have a difficult time, as you're saying, Beth, like, what are those things? But in these stories, especially those three, you embody the whirlwind. And that's really powerful. They're more than characters. You just get into them and you're embodied in there. It's really great. So Jim kind of touched upon this, but I think one of the pleasures of both of your collections is the sense of form or shape. And because they're both collections where stories they can be read as link story collections, and certain characters reappear. So Beth has Layla appear in Still Soft, Still Whole, and Deadheading. And then there's a series of longer stories that Beth writes, but they're preceded by several short flash fictions. And that sense is really great. And then Jim has these clear sections that are titled, and then they're made up of various interconnected stories, like that section, The Secret of Whirlwinds. There's an unnamed woman and Frank, and they move through the three stories. So in both, it's rather wonderful. And the only thing I could equate it to is just thinking about Russian dolls and how the stories start to nest together. Or even like waves, like there's these waves where the characters and story continue to move on. So my question is, was your sense of structure or shape in your collection something that you envisioned from the beginning, or was it more of a discovery in writing the stories?
For me, it was discovery. I work very much like Jim does. In our business, as you guys know, we have the planners and we have what everyone calls the pantsers. Well, I'm of the pantser family, which probably causes me more work in revision than it would if I planned. But I like to, like Jim, I like to be surprised and find out where things are going. So in the early drafts, everything is very intuitive. But as I was putting the collection together, I did think a lot about that structure, what I like as a reader, as far as, length of stories and chapters. If there's a long story, particularly if it's a slow burn, I really love to change it up with a fast-paced short story, like a flash. I grew up with a musician, and we made mixtapes and all of those things when we were kids. And I think of it kind of like putting together a concept album. Vinyl's back, and that's kind of how I think of it. I thought about tension along the way, and this is why Still Soft, Still Whole, and Deadheading are at the very end, because I felt like it built in tension all the way through the story and then sort of ended with a punch.
Yeah.
And you're like, whoa. So I did think about all those things and played with the structure a lot in revision and putting together the final manuscript. But in the early drafts, no, I just kind of follow what's happening, follow the character. And, I didn't even realize when I finished Still Soft, Still Whole that I was going to write another story with Layla, but she kept bothering me. So I was like, okay, we're not done with you yet.
Well, I love that. It's like both stories exist uniquely, but it does continue that punch. So you're saying that when you write, Beth, it's the writing itself is an act of discovery, but then you go back and create the structure or shape by writing it with the reader in mind, or rereading the material and how a reader would engage with it.
Yes.
Good. Thank you. It's good to hear. And Jim,
Mhm.
what about you? Because I mean, you have the structure is very clear. Were you thinking about that in the beginning, or was it something you also discovered?
Well, in the beginning, I definitely wasn't thinking
Yeah.
about the structure of the whole thing. Even when I had most of this book written, it was this jumble. And I realized that there were different voices and different tones and different things going on. And so I kind of structured the sections thematically. And that way, different stylistic things could happen within the thematically connected stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That creates variety and keeps you from locking into one voice or something. But each story resonates thematically, I think. And section really, that first section and the prologue, the little short piece prologue, which is one of my favorite pieces in the story, is that prologue. They are all about men and women, the relationship between men and women in some way or another. Okay. And then it stays that way with the second section, but the style I feel is very different in the second section. That The Lair of Herself, which is 3 relatively short stories about the encounters between men and women, but they are it's not in that quick action kind of storytelling like I did in the gun story. It's more ruminative. Some of it is anyway. And then, but then I had this other group of stories that was doing something really different, and they were really weird. I thought, wow, these are the strangest things I've ever written. And they are kind of thematically of a whole sort of. So I tried to put that deep in the manuscript, but then I wanted to return to the men and women thing in the last 2 sections. So the Kiva story, which is the longest story, comes after that group of shorter things that are kind of. So, but I wanted to somehow take the reader away, and then snap them back to where we had been sort of thematically before. That's what I wanted to do. So I don't know if that worked or not, but that's part of what I was working with.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does work. My take would be, and this will be a surprise, a pleasant surprise for a reader, is that it's almost like those sections are individual books, little novels, and that really makes the collection powerful. So I think grouping them theme like that was good.
Yeah.
So another kind of long preface to a question. A lot of people envision the short story as having a main character who undergoes, fights, or ignores some kind of change. And it's very fascinating how you both approach change. Beth writes of women who struggle with generational change, economic changes, even environmental changes. And often there's an unstated conflict that these younger women, they look to the past and they're not sure if the past is really offering them anything for the present, or they aren't sure how to accept or take it. And that's very powerful. And Jim writes of change a lot through his characters too. And often they kind of wonder what they should do. There's affect and ennui that seems to weigh on characters who are caught up in the sameness or comfort of their lives. And then they experience these magical transformations. So when you two are writing stories, how do you approach character and change?
Starters, Beth. Yeah.
That's a really good question. I think it's intuitive for me. And you have to have some kind of impetus for change, or you wouldn't have a story at all, right? It would just be description of a place or an object or what have you. But, you know, with all of the trauma, I tend to write the aftermath of trauma. I am more interested in seeing how people adapt to trauma, how they continue to live after such horrific things, whether it be the past with generational trauma, with what they've witnessed themselves, with alcoholism, mental illness, all of these things. I am more interested in seeing how they live after the fact. So most of the traumatic incidents take place off camera or off stage. Yeah. So, and I think that just comes from my personal experience, particularly with witnessing so many people from my grandparents' generation and my mom and their struggle. It has to do with trying to create agency for people who had none, for women who had none in particular, in the South in the past, 100 years or so. But yeah, I think that's how I approach it. I want people to change, but they don't, even characters, they don't always listen to you. So I follow them as they make terrible decisions and try to translate that to the page.
So that, just quickly, so that suggests like that, not just that the trauma is subtext, but that the trauma is palpable and it's everywhere around the characters you write. And so you don't have to spend a lot of time.
I feel like,
driving.
Yeah, I feel like that's true. I feel like it even shows itself in nature and in the houses, the structures. It's a bit of that Southern Gothic tradition where everything is decaying and crumbling around you, and it's just as much psychological as setting in place or any of those things. And as we move into climate catastrophe, it's more and more in the environment as well.
Yes. So not only is the environment, desecrated, somewhat ruined, but then also the mill closes down, and it just sort of great.
Yeah.
How about for you, Jim? What's the how do you work with character and change in your stories?
I'm not sure. You caught me here a little bit. It's interesting to think about it. I'm having to interpret myself because it's largely unconscious, But I think what we touched on before, I think it's sort of built into me to be going through processes and change. And it is with everybody. I think that's what we were just talking about. But a lot of times people don't realize that, and they don't want that. They don't think they want change. Some people really want it badly because what's happening to them is not so good. But my characters, I think a lot of these characters are searching for. But let's just take. I can't remember her name now, and she's my character in the Secret of Whirlwinds section. Is it Sarah? Is that right? Let's just say Sarah. Okay, that'll work. She's unhappy in her marriage, and then she stumbles upon this transformative experience that throws her out of that whole world that she was in, and whether she wants to be out or not, really, I don't think after what happens to her in the first section with the whirlwind, I don't think she doesn't even feel any choice. Her life is going to change completely from that moment on. And then the rest of that story is about not only how her life is changing, but she's drawing Frank in And Frank now is also entering that kind of transformative experience with her. And it's I think it's a transformation from being trapped in a mindset,
Mhm.
being trapped in a mindset, and then discovering that we don't have to have that mindset. It can be something else just as easily, but we forget that. We don't know that. We don't think we have the agency to go through that kind of change, but we do. So anyway, that's what I hope that's what a lot of my stories are doing. It's bringing character to this point where, it's almost like their minds go blank. In fact, that happens to a lot of my characters. Their minds go blank because what was running their mind before no longer works. It no longer applies. And now for a while, they're just kind of in a void. And then they have to figure out from there how to become whatever it is they're going to be. I hope that makes sense.
It does. And you both use the word agency in it. It just makes me think that a lot of your characters in both collections, they get so stuck in the way things are or the way things used to be, they can't recognize the story that they need to tell themselves. And that's part of the change in the agency.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In my story for Blaze of Sight, the main character has lost her sister in a tragic car accident, and she starts making crop circles to try to cope with losing a sister she was very close to. And it's really weird, and she has no idea why she started doing this. It's just sort of a compulsion after she's watching these, like middle of the night shows on the History Channel. But there's this line in it which always sticks with me, and it's some events are asteroids, and it shakes everything. It shakes your orbit. It completely changes everything. And I think that's what Jim is articulating as well. And I can definitely see that in your stories.
Yeah. In some way, it has to happen to you. I used the word agency, but in some way, it has to happen to you. And maybe agency isn't the best word. In other words, what was that famous line? Who was one of the famous critics said this about Robert Frost, that he had written more great poems than almost any other poem of his time. Most poets write only 2 or 3 really great poems, even if they're really good. And he's compared this and he said, if you want to get struck by lightning, you have to walk out into a field in a thunderstorm. He's not. It's not his agency that makes him get struck.
It's true.
It's his openness to being struck by lightning. And I think that sense of being open and not forcing things. That's probably what negative capability means too. Keats's term is very similar to that. I've lost where I was going with that, but I'll stop.
Well, Keats is always a good place to stop.
Yeah.
Not to reach for fact or thought, but to go into the mystery.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you just really explained Beth's story, not explain the whole story, but an insight into it. Still soft, still whole, that she finds out that Layla finds out she's married to a man who has some nefarious secret things happening, and he becomes more violent.
Right.
And she steps out into the fog, the night, the storm, early dawn, and she sees that some snakes have gotten into the baby birds. And it's not her agency. He comes out, and his violence that he chops the head off the snake.
Right.
Yeah.
And then she wraps it around her at the end. It's great.
Yeah.
That was one when I wrote it, I was like, whoa, that got dark.
Yeah.
That came out of me. Oh.
Well, that's an amazing thing, right? That's part of what I think you guys are talking about a lot, is that discovery, and you're astonished that what you wrote, that came out of me. who was that person who wrote that? You know?
Right. Right. And that's that negative capability.
Yeah.
Most young writers that I work with, they're so writing out of their very tight experience that in a way they're not, they don't realize I could do that. I could do that. I could do that, and that's the whole process to me is helping them figure that out. I mean, I had teachers do that for me, so I try to do it for them.
Me too.
Yeah.
And because even though you're writing about experiences that you know in some way, it's not you that it's not like you biographically who writes it. It's almost like you got to become someone else to discover these stories and be there with the characters.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that you learn to stand outside of your personal life.
Mm-hmm.
Then ironically, you can write about that personal life more powerfully because you understand it more fully from the outside. You're close to it, but you've stepped away, and now you can see it objectively. So the motives of your characters become much more clear than if you're writing from inside it. Now you can't. Now you're too identified, and you're kind of serving yourself. I know these are weird ideas, I think, but it's the way it's come through for me. Yeah.
Now when you write, you got to become a whirlwind for a little while.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
I was gonna we're moving close towards the end. I was gonna ask the cliche. It's not a cliche question because I'll just do it for people who read the collection. You both have a very specific sense of place, and Beth's described it a lot. And that's a powerful part of the book, both books. And so it was the question about whether you think you're Southern writers or not. And I have a sense that you're Southern writers, but not really. You have a more particular region or place that you're delving into. But anyways, the title of our talk is The Lasting Impact of the Short Story.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe to kind of wrap up in the last few minutes, for both of you, what is the lasting impact of the short story?
I'm glad you're going first, Beth.
Well, after poetry, short stories, and I don't consider myself a poet. I do some hybrid work, and I have a collaborative partner that we're working on a hybrid collection. His name is Jim Warner. He's the poet, and he starts with the haiku, and I write the prose that goes with it. We're close to finishing that, but I don't consider myself a poet, just a lover of poetry. And short stories are my first love. I found Edgar Allan Poe stories very, very young, probably too young. And I was like, whoa, that's messed up. I love it. I was a small goth child in North Carolina in the 80s. My mother didn't know what to do with me. But I can remember reading The Telltale Heart at a very young age. And I can remember how my body felt reading that. Mm-hmm. And, there's that great quote from Emily Dickinson where she talks about knowing it's poetry when she feels like the top of her head's come off. Mm-hmm. And when I read that, I was like, oh, yes, that's how I feel when I read a really good story. And I've done quite a lot of editing work too. And I worked for Little Fiction, which was a great online magazine, for about 5 years. And I worked for Fourth River out of Chatham University and have done some reading for creative nonfiction. So multiple genres. And it's always the same. Like, I think I love novels and I love the slow burn. And I think novels can be lyrical and impactful and all of these things too, of course. But I feel like with the distillation in short stories, they can have even more of an impact, an echo, or what they call like a long tail, right? I feel like they can just stick. And, that my experience of reading Telltale Heart is gosh, this is sound terrible. It's almost like an addict chasing that high, right? You know, as an editor, I know it right away if I feel that story in my body, if it evokes real emotion, like if it makes me cry in public. That was always one of my rules. If it makes me cry in public, you know, back in the before times, I was like, okay, that's getting at least another read.
Yeah.
So I love a short story, and I don't know if I'll ever write a novel, but short stories have my heart.
Yeah. Yeah. I read a lot of the Poe stories too. Yeah. I think one of the things I learned somewhere along the way that was that a writer or any artist of any kind really has to fall in love with the strange. There's got to be, I feel like that all great writers, I don't care who you name, you're going to find that a lot of that work is just downright weird, strange. Let's use the word strange. And there was a great article, I think it was the writer David Long, who wrote an essay in Poets and Writers years ago called Make It Strange. And I thought, wow, that's right. That's so true what he's saying. So I read those Poe stories, but I'll tell you something that influenced me hugely when I was a kid, and a lot of people have had this experience, was the Twilight Zone.
Yes.
Now, when I grew up, it was the first run of the series. I was seeing them fresh right out of the can, you know. And in the I guess 62, I think, was when maybe they started. And I was like, what was I? I was like 13 in 62 or 14. And man, I mean, I would get everything just right in the room. I'd have whatever I wanted to drink, man. I would sit there and it would just totally take me away. And those are short form. Those are basically short form stories. 30 minutes or less. And with the commercials, they're even less, probably 20, 25 minutes. And I just loved them. And they just kept influencing me. I kept looking for a way to figure out how to do that. At the best of the Twilight Zone stories are you know, can really zap you. So I like being zapped. I'm like Beth. I like that, whoa, that jolt of recognition or realization, that jolt. Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out a way to do that. You know, you succeed sometimes and you don't other times, but it's so much fun doing this. Don't you have fun with this, Beth?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I it's just my, you know, it's too late for me to find something else. It's my favorite thing to be connected to and to do is to write stories and poems. So I just hope that, to get back to the word impact, that I can create that kind of startle and surprise in readers that the writers I love have created in me and they still do it for me, you know? Yeah. Because so that startle, right? Isn't that the point where transformation is possible? You're startled and it's like right in that little spot, transformation is possible. It seems like.
It sounds like too, though, for both of you, that even though that impact can be emotionally heavily, take your top of your head off, right? You encounter the strange, there's still an element of, we discover a pleasure that we didn't know that we wanted. And as you were saying, Jim, that seems fundamental when we begin. You both seem like two writers who have a lot of pleasure writing stories because you love language, and that's really important to begin with.
It's true. And I've got 4 or 5 failed novel attempts because I was not having fun anymore. I was like, this is no longer fun.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, this was a wonderful conversation. We went a little over an hour. I really appreciate, I could keep talking with you two for hours. I appreciate the creativity and thoughtfulness of your answers and just the conversation. And people should go out and get Deadheading and The Sadness of Whirlwinds. They're 2 powerful collections. As Emily Dixonton, take the top of your head off, or Franz Kafka said a book is an axe that goes through the frozen sea that's inside of us. These
Yeah,
are two books that work in an axe like that.
I always loved
Thank
that.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Fred.
This was
Thank you,
so,
Fred.
so fantastic. Fred, you were fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, and it was so great listening to you. I loved listening. I loved that last question, particularly about the impacts of short stories. And I absolutely agree with both of you, Jim and Beth, about how there's just some stories that just like they stick with you for a long time, and you just don't really realize how much of an impact it made on you. And like the Poe stories, I also read those when I was quite young also. And, you know, as I read more short story collections, there's always like one or two that stand out that just I take with me. And so it's always a delight to hear from short story writers. And Red Hen I'm so glad that Red Hen continues to publish short story collections. So
Me too.
thank you guys so much. We'll remove you from the screen now.
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us. Don't forget, if you purchase a copy of The Sadness of Whirlwinds or Deadheading and Other Stories tonight, you'll get a bonus book in your package. That's a free book if you buy one of these. So get your copies now. I'll drop the link in the chat in just a second. Our next Hen House event will be on Wednesday, October 20th, featuring memoirists Jan Beatty and Joan Knuckles-Wilson. So if you're working on memoirs that are difficult to write because they're so deeply personal, I think you'll really enjoy this conversation with these two writers who bared their souls on the page in their most recent books. Also, join us tomorrow for Art Night Pasadena. We're going virtual again this fall. So visit our webpage via cityofpasadena.net/artnight tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pacific. And join us on Zoom for a publishing talk with yours truly. Zoom info can be found on our social media platforms. Have a fantastic rest of your evening, and thank you again for joining us. I'll drop the link to the collections right now. And we'll see you again soon.